So now we move on. I'm really happy to welcome Julie Lawson, who's, through her expertise, is going to, again, put this in the international comparative perspective. So really glad you're here, Julie. I'm going to hand you the microphones. Just to remind to, indeed, I haven't been doing it myself, but to stay relatively close to this one and to hold this.
Okay, thanks. So while Gerlinda is powering up the laptop, I probably should take the opportunity to thank her and also to thank Gerard for organising such a thought-provoking and important conversation and for your dedication to knowledge exchange and debate around this important public policy question. The first thing to note, of course, is the whole thing about the word shaping and the idea that markets are something which are shaped. They're shaped largely by ideas and debates, discussions and power struggles in society that have often a long historical roots in their countries, if in particular in their cities, if we take Vienna. So we can't necessarily, hop from one to the other and assume that they might fly. But some ideas seem to fly faster and more dominant than others. We can't deny that. So there's a hell of a lot of policy exchange going on, osmosis, transporting of ideas, but not all of them seem to be equally able to do that. And there's reasons behind that. And it goes partly in the plumbing of our financial sector and the way in which we enable particular circuits to flourish and other ones to be, if you like, oppressed, suppressed, and put back in the naughty corner, as we've done since the 1990s to what I would call a more purposeful housing finance system than what we have today. And of course, everybody's heard about the importance of housing, that housing's at the centre. We know that the New Urban Agenda put that on the table and said housing is at the centre. But what is it at the centre of? Some have argued that housing has become the single largest, if you like, asset class. And we're in a phase of a new asset economy. Now, these are not just some people, these are some of our most prominent international academics speaking on housing, such as Susan Smith, William Clark, Rochelle Ong, Gavin Wood, and many others who are leaders in their fields of housing economics, economic geography, political economy. And they talk about the unprecedented accumulation of wealth which has been occurring in residential property markets and a long wave of housing price appreciation which has occurred and, as I say, across jurisdictions, which has turned residential property into the largest capital asset class in the investable economy, exceeding the combined value of equities, commercial property, agricultural land, forestry, and all gold that has ever been mined. So housing has become a subject of accumulation. But it's also become, if we read the European Commission's report in 2022, also a story of boom and bust, a story of the steady growth of prices, especially since 2013. And of course, even during the pandemic, it rightly charts an explosion of prices. So how has this all come about? There's a really great book called Milestones in Housing Finance Systems by Lunt and Whitehead, which gives that story for different nation states. But we've also tried to, if you like, reduce that story down to something meaningful for comparative purposes with my colleague Michelle Norris. written a paper at online open access called Tools to Tame Financialisation, which looks at the ways in which governments have had choices in shaping their financial systems, the regulation of their mortgage markets, and in choosing what to grow in terms of the scale of the financial circuits involved. Also, the number and type of those financial circuits. What sorts of financial circuits do we allow to prosper? For example, our shadow banks or our savings and loans. Which ones are we actually enabling? And we do so through regulation, of course, at the national level. And also what's been their focus, what are we encouraging those players to invest in? We know in terms of some circuits of investment, some governments have chosen to have a purposeful approach to grow a sustainable and productive economy, and others have chosen to have a more hands-off approach. Some have even talked about those approaches in geopolitical terms as well, with China or South Korea and its history, or the United States, which also has a fairly strong voice on what and where. But we've also have ideas about, no, we mustn't have credit guidance, we mustn't have a say in what we actually to pursue. In terms of where we invest. And of course, the big discussion has been also on the role and the limits of monetary policies, the limits of our central banks in what they've been doing, and the call from some to say, hey, isn't it about time that we considered the purposeful and sustainable directions of our capital flows and so on. And furthermore, we also have different financial circuits which have different costs. We know, for example, that it's very cost effective for governments to be involved in direct investments but of course they have been placed in that naughty corner since around the end of the 1980s. And we see in some turnarounds, for example, the decision of May and Hammond to enable cities to have a more active role again a few years ago, which led to the City of London, for example, resuming its active role in housing provision. So I know I'm going to run out of time, and you know the story about the harsh market realities of what a free, so-called free housing market has for productivity, for efficiency, and for responsiveness. You also are well versed as housing researchers, advocates, and advocates about the stagnations of incomes amongst certain categories of workers. You know about the implications of overheated housing markets and the impacts indebtedness has, especially on the young. You know that youth housing access is also declining to home ownership, if that's a solution that predominates in your country. And perhaps you're also frightened of the prospect of retiring and being a renter if your welfare provisions or pensions don't allow for housing costs of that nature, as they do not in my country, which is Australia. So we see that cities are sort of trying to make up for the lack of if you like, careful, thoughtful, coherent policy at the national level. We miss them in action, and so we know that we see around us some very active cities trying, but frankly, they're trying in the absence of rules which really make a big difference. They need that national support, and one would hope that in the forum of the UNECE, which has all the focal points of national governments at its table, that should be the message, which is about a more purposefully regulated housing finance system for the future. So governments certainly have a role to play, and that's what Housing 2030 was all about, is about more capable government roles in actual policy design and shaping better markets. But of course, that doesn't mean that it's the same thing everywhere, and that we need to understand, and we talk about the 4 steps in understanding why is it that housing is unaffordable or inaccessible for some households in my country, what changes to the housing system could increase access to affordable housing, and which policy tools would be most appropriate to generate the required outcomes. And of course, what capabilities are required to implement this policy at the required scale. Too often we're just tinkering around the edges. So this approach encourages a systemic review and a careful strategic approach to policy design, which would differ from country to country and over time. So in Housing 2030, we came across and grouped governance tools, finance and investment tools, land policy tools, and also within our decarbonisation agenda, climate neutrality tools. And this involved a almost 2-year collaborative study across policy researchers, also governments and advocates to come together with this really nice report called Housing 2030, which also has about 15 podcasts, some of them core to this 4 chapters, but there's also several which are really taking on the finance side, of which my dear friend here, Stefan Zochner, has also contributed to one on central banks as an independent person, an expert. So I'm just going to pull out a few of the things we talk about, and then about shaping markets. And I refer you really to the research on the website. One of them, out of the, if you like, the land policy toolbox, is the way in which cities can intervene. In the case of Helsinki, for example, this is something a law which came into place immediately after World War II. Well, it took 2 years of chaos before it finally hit them that they needed to do so. In 1947, they enacted a law which enabled them to basically take a purposeful role in the land market. By doing so, they were able to ensure eventually that a diversity of housing outcomes could be resettle the displaced population as it was in the Second World War, and also ensure that communities would be well serviced by appropriate infrastructure, also transport and schools and so on. They now are the leading landholder in that city, and they have 70% of the land surrounding. They are able to be key partners in driving the agenda of supply and the segments of supply to be served. They work together with the national government, forming 30-year agreements over which they can service good, well-planned rollout of their communities and renewal. Another, if you like, circuit of investment, which I think is a very healthy one, is the way in which, what do we do once the loans have been paid off? Which is that what role does the repayment of the tenant's rent have in accumulating a pot to renew, reinvest, improve, grow? And those circuits of investment can be extracted and frittered away, or they can be reinvested for future generations. The best model has those reinvested for future generations. And the way in which those revolving funds work, you can see them differently working in Austria, in Denmark, in Finland, in Slovakia, in Slovenia, and on Housing 2030 website you can learn about how those different revolving funds can work. In a way, this is a nice idea which we could incorporate in the circular economy. I mentioned already multi-level governance, critical that the cities can't do these things alone. They need a framework, they need often the taxation and revenue powers of national governments to redistribute, to ensure equality or equity of outcomes. And they need municipalities who are closest to the people, who can bring the issues together, who have control over the land, who have control over planning powers. And they need responsible housing providers. And that means one that is responsible and regulated to do the job of housing people. That's not something that can be left up to any provider. I really believe that it's a responsibility to actually provide people's homes, an enormous responsibility. Therefore, it requires an accreditation, it requires regulation. If you receive public subsidies, they need to be accounted for and they need to be invested to deliver a social outcome. So this brings us to the question about, what kind of economy? Do we want more solidarity, social harmony, or do we want more inequality and social division and potentially social disharmony and even political backlash? So we need to perhaps, in some of these models they demonstrate, is moving to less priorities on the accumulation of private wealth for some and towards serving communities which enhance social value, involve participatory and democratic governments and promote social inclusion and unity. So I'm not the only one calling for this. You also see leading economists like Mariana Mazzucato and also advocates for human rights, right to adequate housing, also Liani Farr, in their 2023 report, bringing together that mission economy approach with a human rights-based. That was a report that was launched in June this year. And they have a message in there for the third way, or for those who are advocates of public-private partnerships, for example. And I refer you to section 5.1 of this report. It's not just about any kind of partnership. They talk about, in a housing mission, governments must lead efforts to partner with a purpose. Partner with purpose. And that means partners who are also committed to the same common good housing outcomes. It's also about providing adequate options, not only determining what people must have, but enabling those adequate options to be able to be there, to be chosen, if one may choose to do so. And also to avoid, if you like, parasitic and profiteering behaviour, which can emerge in some forms of public-private partnerships. For example, the most exploitative, I believe, is the public-private partnership availability payment model, which is one of the most expensive approaches and quickly exhausts government coffers. And we see that having short-lived life in Ireland, for example. It's touted very widely by private sector consultants, but I can assure you it's one of the most inefficient ways to design a purposeful housing partnership. So other arguments that are used are that housing is far more than social policy. Housing is also economic policy. It's also ecological policy. And we see the advantages, economic advantages, ecological advantages, being pushed by advocates who are out there to try to make the case again and again in any way that Treasury will listen. And we see they're trying to do so, and in so doing, we see a variety of reports out there, and some the economic indicators are well developed and evidence-based. Sometimes they've had the benefit of being funded and doing a proper study, like in WIFO, but that's not always the case. And there are some indicators that are out there wanting for more funding to research their actual evidence base. So AHURI, which is the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, which is a really great non-profit consortium of universities. At the moment, I think there's about 9 universities involved in this partnership, and it brings out the, if you like, the best of different disciplines to deal with the different housing issues. And they have also brought together a recent report called Housing Economic Analysis, and they've done a global review on the many, many different indicators which are out there for review, and look at how well-established established or emerging their evidence bases are. And I encourage you to have a good look at that thorough report. It's an excellent review and a rare one as well. The other issue is, of course, how do we pay for affordable housing? Which mechanisms, what approach do we use? And we see in different countries a general trend towards subsidising demand. So that in doing so, we are subsidising usually typical a private rental household to receive an assistance to rent from a private landlord. And we know that expenditure by governments on these measures has been growing steadily over time. It's flattened a little bit in recent years as governments have cut back after the GFC. But we do see a pretty strong steady pouring of expenditure into recurrent costs on the government budget, rather than a investment in the public estate, perhaps through investment in capital expenditure of buildings. And this has great consequences not only for the cost to government, but also for steering supply and in its inability to do so. And of course, purposeful supply is what we're all about. So let's have a look at some of the arguments on the downside to demand-side approaches. Demand-side approaches have their place. I'm not arguing that they shouldn't exist. My argument is that they've gone too far in one direction, and it's inefficient and perhaps less effective in the long run to take one's hands off the supply side. And you see the benefits of a supply-oriented housing system approach in Austria, and the many benefits that probably has well beyond what you are talking about today in terms of a productive economy, a stable, engaged workforce in the construction sector, and all the many spin-offs in innovation, of energy efficiency, of being if you like, a playground for experimentation of new materials and processes that simply isn't possible in a privately led rental sector. But rent-assisted services alone, they cannot ensure adequate access and are particularly ineffective where provision involves for-profit providers or where rents are deregulated and also vacancies are low. It's a bit like leaving the tap on and trying to mop up. You're just going to keep spending, especially if you have uncapped expenditure in this area of which people are entitled to get. And it's different in the United States where you've got vouchers and they just say, nah, that's finished, it's up. But in the UK and other places in Australia, it really is like mopping with the tap on. And of course, there's been a turnaround in thinking. We see that even happening at the IMF, which has been saying we really need much more effective public investment and more efficient financing of infrastructure. And of course, housing is infrastructure, stressing greater capacity in needs-based planning, securing and allocating adequate funds. And again, this mission-focused approach comes back to mind. I've been working with some people from the EIB as well on looking at what would a capital investment strategy look like that was purposeful, and with keeping in mind the needs of recovery in Ukraine as well. Can you imagine if we just persisted in Ukraine with handing out cash and vouchers? Would we build back better? I don't think so. So careful design of housing subsidies can help policymakers and program designers. We did a lot of work in the late 2010s on the idea of social housing as infrastructure. We looked at modelling of different approaches to of the cost to government of using different policy levers, for example, land and development grants and efficient financing and discounted interest rates, and developed a model called the Affordable Housing Assessment Tool, which would enable governments to say, okay, well, I did this for these groups or these groups. What is the most efficient way to do so? Another evaluation we did on the cost to government of different financing and funding regimes, demonstrating that, for example, PPP model, of the AP model, the way in which if we just end up subsidising the private sector to provide our affordable housing, ends up costing us at least 24% more in terms of how we have to subsidise the rents to make them affordable. So if we are to consider social housing as infrastructure, if we think about it as being foundational, that the role of housing in health, security, stability of the economy, educational attainment of children in secure, stable homes, community inclusion, in terms of social equity, a fairer assistance and allocation, also enabling people to have comfortable and prosperous post-retirement, for example. Also in shaping better markets, innovation, energy efficiency, experimenting with circular economy, promoting and ensuring better environmental outcomes, and also in terms of avoiding costs, inadequate, insecure, unaffordable housing, of course, costs us all dearly. It costs us not only to have someone sleeping under that bridge in terms of ending up in the emergency department, but also in terms of interactions with the law, with justice, with policing, all kinds of costs. And the Australian researchers, again, have been very good at tying down what those costs are per person and what they would save if they were better addressed in other ways. So economists have been busy looking at these questions from all different aspects. We really need them at the moment to be arguing with the Ukrainians about how they think Ukraine, its housing recovery should be stimulated and repaired and move forward. You know, housing is also will be critical to people to be able to return home, to participate in life, the good life, hopefully there. And it's a pity at the moment that housing seems to be absent from Ukraine's recovery plans, and also even discussions with the EU over the use of the facility. We really need to have a concept of housing as being not only essential social policy, but also vital economic infrastructure. Rebuilding Ukraine without an adequate housing to go home to is really not going to solve the problem in the long run. Before I can move on to talk about housing as circular economy, but it's been a very strong feature of the last 2 days. We know that Europe is looked to as a sort of leader in circular economy approaches. It's trying very hard. The Australians are also very interested in doing the same. This lovely graphic here is actually from a novel, a graphic novel on circular economy, an Australian story, but it stems from a serious study of 5 reports of 5 scoping papers on materials, on neighbourhood planning, on processes in building and apartment renovation and retrofitting, which has been brought together towards a strategy for Australia. So thank you for your attention, and all this work is available online, and I hope, and I'd be happy for the presentation to be made available and these web links to be able to be accessed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie. I particularly appreciated this ultimate question of what they call in Germany, or in German, Objekt versus Subject Förderung, so subsidies to the person or to the brick, and as they say in the UK or in the English-speaking world. So, as you pointed out, there's a place for both. Policies have to be adapted, but as we see currently in many of the contexts, an over reliance on this demand side or this Subjektförderung, so subsidies directly to the person, is, as you said, you quite nicely put it, mopping with the tap on. So I don't know if you all got that. So it's cleaning up while the Leitungswasser is still flowing. So indeed shows again the complexity of housing policies, which levers you need in different contexts. But I thought this point came very clearly through. You also, and I really like this approach of talking about these models which reinvest also as part of circular economy. And you mentioned 4 or 5 different countries where indeed, instead of an extractive nature of investment in real estate, where finance is only being extracted for short-term profit, we have many models in Europe, which we should be really proud of, I think, which, as you say, reinvest for future generations. So how can we really understand, demystify those models so that other cities and countries and continents, why not, can also learn from those? I think it's really, insightful point. And another one was the teamwork. So you said this is too complex, too important an issue to be left to one sector. So for instance, in Austria, we've spoken how important the limited profit sector is. However, I think also what we see over these days is they cannot also be left alone. And Gerlinda pointed this out yesterday. I mean, currently they're also facing huge inflationary pressures which maybe will make it more difficult to meet the needs of people, growing needs of cities. So I think this point is also very clear, this teamwork that is needed from different levels of governance, and even a very well functioning sector like the limited profit sector cannot be left alone, and we need a quick turnaround in policies to make sure that the inflationary pressures is not actually putting a stop to the construction, because we see it in many countries. So in France we see an increase of a 0.5 percentage point is costing the social housing sector 1.5 billion a year. So just in half an increase point, we're seeing in most of even the most solid systems, we're seeing that the current the current inflationary trends are putting pressure even on those. So it's time to also think, okay, if we are proud of these sectors, if they're functioning well, how can we make sure that the current changes, so huge, or the huge shifts in the current financial fault lines, so the fault lines in the global financial sector, that we don't let those systems fall through, but that we reinforce them.